The moment I decided to leave, it was as if a switch had been flipped inside me. No more could I remain in a situation where my trust had been shattered, where the foundation of my life had cracked under the weight of betrayal. The life I had known, the one I had built with Karen, the one in which I believed we were partners in all things, was no longer mine. It was an illusion. I could no longer pretend that everything was okay, or that my commitment to this relationship still held any weight. I had to leave. But leaving wasn't something I could do lightly. The path I was about to take required planning, even if I wasn't entirely sure what the future held. What I did know was this: I had given it my all. I had tried everything within my power to fix what was broken, to hold us together, to believe that the life we had shared for so many years could somehow be salvaged. But Karen's actions had left me with no choice. She had crossed a line, and the trust that once defined our marriage was irreparably shattered. The moment I found out about the affair, it was as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath me. The disbelief, the rage, the pain, each emotion crashing over me in waves. I knew I had to act, but I also knew I had to act wisely. I couldn't simply walk out in a fit of anger. I couldn't risk making a decision I'd regret. The days that followed were filled with a mix of strategy and emotional turmoil. I had thought long and hard about how to handle the situation. I wasn't going to leave without speaking to my daughters. Claire and Denise had always been the light of my life, and I couldn't bear the thought of them finding out about the divorce in any other way. But at the same time, I didn't want to burden them with the full weight of Karen's betrayal. I knew they would feel the pain of this, perhaps more than anyone. So, I decided to wait until I had left and was settled before I spoke with them. The first few days were a blur of logistics and painful realizations. I had been living in a fog for so long, unaware of the depth of Karen's deception. Once I started to peel back the layers, the reality of what had been going on behind my back became clearer. Frank, her coworker, had been the catalyst of this destruction. Their affair wasn't a brief lapse in judgment. It was a full-fledged relationship that had been going on for months. I had been living a lie. Karen, who I had trusted with my heart, had not only betrayed me, but had betrayed everything our family stood for. The anger I felt was almost suffocating, but I had to keep my composure. I couldn't let her or anyone else see how deeply this had cut me. The next step was to make sure I wasn't just running away. This wasn't about escaping my problems. It was about reclaiming my life, about regaining the strength I had lost over the years. So, I made the difficult decision to leave the house, to leave everything behind. I needed space to think, to clear my mind. The quiet, the solitude, I would find solace in that. My plan was simple: drive far away, as far as I could go. I started by calling my lawyer. We discussed the next steps in the legal process, though part of me wasn't ready to begin that yet. It felt too final, too real. But there was no denying that the end was coming, and I needed to prepare. My lawyer reassured me that I was making the right decision. Divorce was inevitable, and it was better to act sooner rather than later. Karen had already begun the process of contacting the attorney I had hired years ago to handle our family's legal matters. She wasn't ready to accept the consequences of her actions, and part of me was angry that she was pretending as if nothing had changed. Once the phone call ended, I couldn't help but think about the life I had once believed in. It seemed almost absurd now, looking back at how naive I had been to believe that Karen would never betray me. She had always been so convincing, so full of excuses when I questioned her behavior. But the truth was plain to see now. There had been no real remorse, no apology. She had tried to justify her actions by saying I had failed her, that I wasn't enough, that I was too busy. But the truth was more painful than that. I wasn't the one who had betrayed her. She had made her choice, and now she had to face the consequences. The decision to leave wasn't just about escaping my marriage. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my peace of mind, and most importantly, my sense of self-worth. For far too long, I had let myself believe that I wasn't good enough, that I had to change for someone else to be happy. But the truth was different. I wasn't the problem. I wasn't the one who had broken the vows. I had tried to save us, to make our marriage work. But in the end, it was Karen who had chosen a different path. I made the call to my daughters. Claire was the first to pick up. Her voice trembled as she asked me where I was. She had heard from her mother, of course, and her concern was palpable. She was upset, confused, and I knew she wouldn't understand the full depth of the situation.
How could she?
She was still young, still processing the world through the lens of her own experiences. But I had to explain it to her. I had to be honest, even though I knew it would hurt her. I told her that Karen and I were separating, that I was leaving. I could hear the shock in her voice as she tried to grasp what I was saying. But why, Dad? Claire asked, her voice breaking. Why would you leave? What happened? I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. I explained as best I could, showing her the pictures and the evidence I had gathered. I didn't want to lay everything bare, but I had to show her the truth. She deserved to know. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I don't understand, Dad. How could Mom do this? How could she hurt you like this? Claire finally said. I don't know, sweetheart, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. But this isn't your fault. I don't want you to think that any of this is on you. Despite her initial shock, Claire agreed to keep the information private, not wanting to tell her mother just yet. She wanted to think it through, to process it, and I respected that. It wasn't easy for her, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I promised her that we would talk more in person. Denise was next. I braced myself for her reaction, knowing it would be different from Claire's. Denise was always the more logical, level-headed one. She had a way of seeing things for what they were, without all the emotional entanglements that sometimes clouded Claire's judgment. When I told her, I expected anger. But instead, she just listened. Dad, I don't even know what to say, Denise said quietly. Are you okay? I'm not sure, honey, I replied. But I have to do this. I have to leave. Denise didn't press me for more details, which was a relief. She wasn't ready to process it all yet. She just wanted to be there for me, and that meant more to me than words could express. After our conversation, I knew that the next step would be the hardest one, telling Karen. The day I called Karen, I knew it would be difficult. It was impossible to talk to her without feeling a surge of anger, but I had to remain calm. We spoke briefly, and I laid out the truth. I was leaving, and I would no longer tolerate the deceit. She tried to defend herself, but it was clear that the relationship was over. There was no going back. I had already made my decision. As soon as I hung up, I packed a bag and left. I didn't want to say goodbye to the house or the life I had known for so long. It felt like I was walking away from everything, my memories, my family, my identity. But in truth, I was walking toward something new, something better. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't need to. I just needed to be free. Free from the pain, the lies, and the constant reminder of what had been broken. I drove for hours, the wind in my hair, the road ahead stretching out like a blank canvas, waiting for me to create my new life. The journey had just begun. The first days after I left felt like a strange, surreal dream. I was physically alone, yet emotionally tangled in the remnants of what I had walked away from. I thought leaving would bring relief, but instead, it brought an overwhelming sense of emptiness, like a gaping hole that nothing could fill. I had no illusions left about Karen's infidelity. I had seen the proof with my own eyes, the texts, the photos, the lies she'd told. Yet even knowing the truth didn't make the emotional fallout any easier to bear. The betrayal had dug so deeply into my soul that it felt like a part of me had been severed. I had driven for hours that first day, not caring where I went, as long as it was far enough away from the life I once knew. I needed distance, physical and mental. But even in the vast openness of the countryside, in the anonymity of unfamiliar towns and roads, my mind kept circling back to the same questions. How had it come to this? What had I missed? I had been so invested in our life together, in making everything work, in protecting our family, that I hadn't seen the cracks that were forming under the surface. The fact that Karen had been seeing someone else for months without me knowing, while I believed we were happy, that we had a strong bond, was a blow I still struggled to comprehend. I stopped at a small motel just outside of town. It was nothing special, a single-story building with faded signage and an old neon light buzzing softly in the dusk. It had the kind of tired charm that made you feel as though you were the only person in the world who had ever walked through its doors. I didn't need much, just a bed for the night, a place to be alone with my thoughts. As I checked in, the clerk gave me a knowing smile, as if she could tell I was carrying a weight that had nothing to do with my suitcase. I couldn't help but wonder if others, too, came here to escape their lives for a while. Perhaps it wasn't just about the rooms and the beds, it was about the temporary freedom from everything that hurt. I sat on the bed, my fingers nervously tapping on the edge of the nightstand. I thought about the conversation I had with Claire and Denise. They both deserved better. Neither of them should have to carry the burden of their mother's choices, nor should they have to pick sides. Yet I knew it was inevitable. Divorce wasn't something that could remain neutral. The fault lines were there, and no amount of time would erase them. They would be caught in the fallout. It broke my heart, but there was nothing I could do to fix that. The damage had already been done, and it was time to face reality. The life I had built for 20 years had disintegrated into something unrecognizable, and now I had to find a way to start over. Over the next few days, I spent hours walking through the small towns nearby, trying to clear my head. I visited parks, sat on benches, and watched people live their ordinary lives. It was strange, almost surreal, how unaffected everyone seemed by the turmoil that had consumed me. It felt as though I had been thrust into a world of strangers who couldn't possibly understand what I was going through. How could they? I hadn't even fully understood it myself. My phone remained on silent for most of those days. I couldn't bring myself to speak to Karen. She had tried to call a few times, and each time I ignored her calls. I couldn't face her, not yet. There were so many things I still needed to process, so many unanswered questions. I had no intention of giving her the chance to manipulate the situation further, to apologize in ways that felt more like justifications than admissions of guilt. One evening, I sat at a diner and stared at my reflection in the window, the dim lights casting shadows across my face. I looked older, tired, weary. My life, the life I had known, had changed in ways I couldn't yet fully grasp. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Was I still the same man who had loved Karen for so long? Or had I become someone else entirely? Someone scarred and broken by the lies I had been fed? It wasn't long before I realized I couldn't stay in that motel forever. As much as the isolation felt necessary, it wasn't going to heal me. I needed to go back, to face the music, as they say. The future wasn't going to wait for me to figure everything out. Life would keep moving forward whether I was ready or not. I rented a small apartment in a city I had never lived in before. The change of scenery felt necessary, if only to put a physical distance between me and everything that had once been home. It was in an older building on the second floor, overlooking a bustling street corner. The apartment itself was small, but the light that filtered in through the windows was warm and inviting, and that small comfort was enough to make it feel like a temporary refuge. When I finally spoke to Karen, I was calm, perhaps too calm. The anger that had consumed me before had been replaced with a quiet resignation. There was no more fight in me. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the emotions that still bubbled beneath the surface. She tried to deny it at first, but there was nothing she could say that would change the truth. The affair with Frank had been going on for months. She admitted it, though she still insisted it hadn't meant anything. She said it was a mistake, that she had been unhappy for so long. It was the same script, the same excuses she had given every time I asked her about the distance between us. But this time, I didn't want to hear it. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to make sense of it all," I said. "I've been thinking about what we had and what we don't have anymore. And I've come to the conclusion that I can't keep pretending. I can't keep being with someone who doesn't value me." I heard her voice break, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But that sympathy was fleeting. The truth was, she had made her choice, and now I had to live with the consequences of her actions. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice low. There was a long pause before she answered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anymore." The answer stung, but it was what I had expected. She had lost herself in a lie, in a fantasy, and now there was no going back. She had no idea what she wanted, no idea what love really meant. The conversation ended shortly after that. I didn't want to keep dragging it out. I had made my decision. I was leaving, and there was nothing she could say to change that. In the weeks that followed, I continued to adjust to my new life. I saw a counselor, though I wasn't sure it was helping. I couldn't bring myself to talk about my feelings just yet. I wasn't ready to unpack everything that had been buried inside me for so long. Instead, I focused on the practicalities of the situation, setting up utilities, changing my address, and figuring out a way to tell Claire and Denise that I was officially moving out. I spoke to Claire first. She had been asking questions, wanting to know when I would come home, when everything would go back to normal. I knew I had to tell her that things were different now, that normal wasn't something we would ever return to. But how do you tell your child that the life you had given them was built on a lie? How do you explain to them that the family they had once known was no more? "Dad, are you really going to leave?" she asked, her voice trembling as I tried to explain. "Are you sure there's no way you and Mom can work it out?" I wish I could have told her that there was a way, that we could find a way to heal. But I couldn't lie to her. I couldn't tell her that everything was going to be okay when I knew it wouldn't be. I wish I could, sweetheart. But this is something I have to do. I can't stay in a relationship where trust has been broken. I need to take care of myself, too. Denise, on the other hand, was more pragmatic. She didn't ask questions. She didn't want to know the details. She just wanted to know how I was doing and what the next steps were. It was almost as if she had already prepared herself for this moment. She was stronger than I had given her credit for. "We'll get through this, Dad," she said quietly. "We'll be okay." I wanted to believe her. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. I had left. But in many ways, I was only beginning to understand what that truly meant. The days after I spoke to Claire and Denise were some of the hardest of my life. I had expected them to be angry, to resist the changes, but what I hadn't anticipated was how much pain I would feel from their confusion. Claire was old enough to understand that things were not as they seemed, but she was still young enough to wish for a fairy tale ending that would never come. Denise, on the other hand, had already stepped into a kind of reluctant maturity, absorbing the truth with an unsettling calmness. But in both their eyes, I saw the same thing: betrayal. Not from me, but from the world that had been shattered around them. I spent the next few weeks in a haze. I kept the apartment orderly, throwing myself into the mundane tasks of cooking simple meals, cleaning, and trying to establish some sense of routine. But no matter how I tried to fill the emptiness with daily tasks, there was always this gnawing feeling that wouldn't go away. The feeling that the life I had worked so hard to build, the family I had loved so deeply, was gone, and there was no way to ever get it back. There was no blueprint for how to rebuild what had been lost, no guide to how to process the weight of betrayal from someone you thought you knew better than anyone. I worked more than I should have. Immersing myself in my job seemed like the only thing that could give me any relief, any sense of purpose. At work, I could bury the emotions that threatened to rise to the surface. I didn't have to deal with the guilt of leaving or the sense of failure that had been eating at me. But even that didn't last. The moments of escape were fleeting. I found myself snapping at my coworkers for small, insignificant things, or zoning out in meetings. The frustration and pain were always there, a constant hum in the back of my mind. In the evenings, I would go for long walks. It became a ritual of sorts, walking through the city streets, feeling the cool night air on my face, trying to clear my mind. I would pass by familiar places: the diner where Karen and I had shared so many quiet meals, the park where we had once walked hand in hand with the girls. Now they felt like foreign spaces, remnants of a life that no longer belonged to me. I didn't contact Karen much, only when absolutely necessary. There were a few brief phone calls, conversations about the girls, about arrangements, about finances. But even those felt strained, like we were both holding on to the faintest thread of something that had long since unraveled. I could hear it in her voice, the same tone she used when she was trying to convince herself of something, trying to believe in a narrative that wasn't true. I had no interest in playing along anymore. One day, as I was walking down the street, I ran into an old friend from my past, Sarah, someone I had known back in high school. We hadn't spoken in years, but she recognized me immediately. "Nick," she said, a touch of surprise in her voice as she approached. "Wow, it's really you." Her face had changed over the years, but I could still see the same warmth in her eyes. It was a fleeting moment of familiarity in a world that had become alien to me. "Sarah, it's good to see you," I said, offering a half smile. We chatted for a few minutes, and as we spoke, I felt the walls I had built around myself start to crack. There was something about her presence, something comforting in how easily we fell into conversation. She didn't ask me why I looked like I hadn't slept in days or why my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. She didn't question my life or ask about Karen. She simply accepted me for who I was in that moment. Before we parted ways, she gave me her number, telling me we should catch up sometime. "It's been far too long," she said with a knowing look, her tone both friendly and encouraging. I didn't think much of it at first, but later that evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I found myself reaching for the crumpled piece of paper she had handed me. It felt strange, reaching out to someone from the past, but at the same time, it felt like a lifeline, an opportunity to reconnect with a part of myself that had been buried under years of routine and responsibility. I sent her a text, asking if she was free for coffee sometime soon. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I needed something, anything, to remind me that there was still a world beyond the one I had been trapped in. She replied almost immediately, "I'd love that. How about tomorrow?" I agreed, and the next day, I found myself sitting in a small cafe, waiting for her. My mind raced. Was this a mistake? Was I ready for this? I didn't know, but in the pit of my stomach, there was a strange sense of anticipation. When Sarah walked in, she looked the same, yet different. She had grown more confident over the years, and it showed in the way she carried herself. We hugged, and as we sat down, we fell into easy conversation, catching up on the years that had passed since we last spoke. She had been living in the city for a few years now, working in marketing. She had never married, never had children, but she spoke of the future with the same sense of possibility I had once felt. It was a stark contrast to my life now. We spoke for hours, and in that time, I realized something important. I wasn't ready to dive into a relationship, but I was ready to re-enter the world. The world of connection, of friendship, of possibilities. Sarah wasn't an escape from my pain, but she was a reminder that there was life beyond the boundaries I had created. She didn't ask me about Karen or my marriage or the divorce. She didn't pressure me to explain myself or my choices. She simply accepted me as I was trying to become. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I met up several times for coffee, walks, and dinners. She never pushed me, never tried to fix me, but simply allowed me to exist in her presence. I wasn't sure what I was looking for in these meetings, but it became clear that I was starting to heal, not from the pain of Karen's betrayal, but from the weight of isolation. I still thought about Karen every day. I still felt the heavy ache of what could have been. But as I spent more time with Sarah, and as I found small ways to reconnect with the world around me, I began to see a future that didn't involve me being stuck in the past. The healing wasn't quick, but it was happening. Slowly, steadily, like the steady flow of a river eroding the hardest rock over time. One evening, after a particularly exhausting week, I found myself sitting on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set. The city stretched out before me, bustling and alive, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of possibility. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future held, or if I would ever truly be okay. But I was learning to live again. Karen had been my past, but she was no longer my present. And while that fact still stung, I was slowly beginning to accept it. I had lived for so long in the shadow of a life that wasn't mine anymore. Now, I was starting to learn how to walk in the light of the future, however uncertain it might be. And in that moment, as the city hummed below me, I finally understood. Life was messy. Relationships were fragile. But the only way to move forward was to keep going one step at a time. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.